David Jones is arguably the greatest native British modernist. He was a great poet. He wrote two of the great long poems in English literature. In Parenthesis, published in 1937, and The Anathemata, published in 1952. And he was also a hugely important visual artist, whom Kenneth Clark thought was the greatest living British visual artist. But he's difficult to come to terms with because the poetry is long, it's unanthologizable. If you excerpt bits, you don't get a sense of the full strength of the work. And the visual art is not quickly seen and appreciated. You've got to look at it for a long time. You've got to take time to actually read the visual art. David Jones was born in 1895 in Brockley, which was not then incorporated into London. Jones was influenced by his mother, who was an accomplished Victorian draftswoman. And encouraged largely by her, but also by his father, he drew from the age of 5. And he drew continually, and he drew beautifully. In 1903, he was looking out the front window on Arabin Road, where he lived, and saw a bear being led by a trainer and forced to dance, which to him was actually a horrible sight. But that bear, Jones drew first the outline of the bear, then the bear was led away, and he filled the bear's fur in, and then he drew a fence, and he used a ruler to draw a fence, and his sister said, real artists don't use a ruler, and David said to his sister, bugger what a real artist would do, and he used the ruler anyway. And later in life, Jones thought that this work was still one of his best drawings. And in the 1960s, he had it up on his wall. It was an example for him that art doesn't progress or improve as a person ages. And that bear becomes the prototype of later paintings of victims, including Aphrodite and Aulus, who's chained at the ankle. He interrupted his art school training to go to war in 1914. He served longer in the war than any other British writer, 117 weeks. He was a good soldier. He described himself in parenthesis as a knocker over of piles of rifles, and as incompetent as a parade soldier. And indeed he was. He couldn't tell his left foot from his right when he was ordered to turn right, turn left. And many people have thought that this clumsiness meant he was an incompetent soldier, but Jones disliked that assumption. Jones was a cunning, competent, practical soldier. That's why he survived the war. He could tell by the sound of a shell coming in which direction it was coming in, and could jump to the right side of the parapet and escape the explosion. He was involved in many raids. He went on night patrol whenever he could, partly to escape fatigue duty. He was a first-class shot at the beginning of the war. He was an excellent soldier, but not a parade soldier. Jones was involved in the assault on Mehmet's Wood in the Battle of the Somme, when Jones was wounded in the leg and had to go to England for recovery. While on leave, he visited Hartrick, who was an editor of the graphic magazine, and Hartrick commissioned him to give him a drawing of the assault on Mehmet's Woods. And this is a fairly realistic depiction of the entrance of his battalion into the woods. The war affected him for the rest of his life. He said he couldn't get it out of his mind. He was haunted by images of broken trees and broken bodies, mutilated bodies. I remember him telling me, there are many worse things in war than death. And as a result of his experience of war, especially of constant, horrific artillery fire, on average 2 barrages a week, he suffered what was then called neurasthenia, which we now call PTSD for the rest of his life. He had 2 severe nervous breakdowns, one in 1933, the other in 1947. He suffered decades of clinical depression, largely because of this war. After the war, Jones discovered engraving when he saw Desmond Shute at Ditchling, engraving a boxwood block. He expressed interest, and Shute took him on as a student. And within a week, Shute knew that David Jones was more accomplished as a visual artist than he was. Jones was a master of design, and this is evident in his engravings above any other of his work. Because engraving is a pared down, controlled, simplified art form. It exists by virtue of exclusion of everything else but basic form. His best engravings are the last of the Book of Jonah engravings, in which Jonah is in the heat under a kind of shelter, and this sense of heat just radiates through this engraving. He then went on to do the frontispiece of a Welsh translation of the Book of Ecclesiastes. And on the basis of that engraving, he was given the commission to do the Deluge. And those are very accomplished wood engravings and very rich and complex. And then when he took on the commission to illustrate the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, he had to pare down his visual form to absolute essentials. And there you've got strictly, predominantly anyway, line. He also developed a kind of scrapey technique to give sheen to water and to skin. And those illustrations to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner are recognized as the best illustration to that poem. As a painter, he moved away from a kind of realistic, competent depiction to a kind of new aesthetic of delicacy and transparency and an approach to chaos, so that his paintings incorporate a sense of freedom that make them challenging for the viewer. To see a David Jones painting, you have to take time and pause and look at it, and not just look at it, but read the painting. The paintings have a kind of delicacy and a kind of shyness in them that makes them inaccessible to a quick, superficial glance. And that's because he achieves a sort of balance between form and chaos, in which the form seems to come alive and to move. One of the things I want to mention is his inscriptions, which are really astonishing, and they combine his visual art and the kind of freedom he attempted to achieve in his visual art with poetry, modernist aesthetics and poetry, because he would take texts from Welsh or Latin sources and juxtapose them. And the reason he used Latin largely and Welsh is he didn't want you to read them. He wanted you to see them. He wanted it to be fundamentally a visual experience, not the kind of experience we have when we read a text and we don't see the letters, we just read them. He invented the painted inscription as an art form, and they are among his greatest works. Jones started writing poetry because he came down with the flu and wasn't well enough to paint. The first draft of In Parenthesis was finished in 1932, but it was published in 1937. So there were 5 years of revision. In Parenthesis is a making present again of his experience in the first 7 months of the Great War.
Well, this is a section from early on in Parenthesis about the incredible tedium of sentry duty at night, and the deepened stillness as a calm cast over us, a potent influence over us and him, dead calm for this sargasso dank and for the creeping things. You can hear the silence of it. You can hear the rat of no man's land rut out intricacies, weasel out his patient workings, scrut, 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 harrow out earthly, trowel his cunning paw, redeem the time of our uncharity to sap his own amphibious paradise. You can hear his carrying parties rustle our corruptions through the night weeds, contest the choicest morsels in his tiny conduits, bead-eyed feast on us by a rule of his nature, at night feast on the broken of us. Those broad-pinioned, blue-burnished or brinded back, whose proud eyes watched the broken emblems droop and drag dust, suffer with us this metamorphosis. These too have shed their fine feathers. These too have slimed their dark, bright coats. These too have condescended to dig in. The white-tailed eagle at the battle ebb, where the sea wars against the river, the speckled kite of Malden and the crow have naturally selected to be unwinged, to go on the belly, to sap, sap, sap with festered spines, arched under the moon, ferret with whiskered snouts the secret parts of us. When it's all quiet, you can hear them scrut, scrut, scrut. When it's as quiet as this is, it's so very still. Your body fits the crevice of the bay in the most comfortable fashion imaginable. It's cushy enough. The relief elbows him on the fire step. All quiet, China? Bugger all to report? Kipping, mate. Christ, mate, you have 'em all over.
Most people, they appreciate In Parenthesis because it's so poignant, because you get to know the infantrymen who die, and it's so moving, and the celebration of their goodness in the visitation by the Queen of the Woods, who bestows garlands according to their virtues, was Jones's favorite part of the poem, and it is one of the most moving passages in English literature. Although to appreciate it fully, you have to have gotten to know those infantrymen by reading the poem as a whole. But by far, Jones thought, and I think it's true, the Anathemata is his greatest work, which is a symbolic, dramatic anatomy of Western culture. It begins with human evolution and flies zigzags back and forth across the centuries, including Nazi and Soviet totalitarianism, symbolically present in Roman imperialism, which Jones was very much against. The thematic meaning of the Anathemata, I think, derives from an experience he had when he was a child. He remembers his mother saying goodbye to a Quaker doctor, and she said, "Tell me, doctor, why did Quakers not have sacraments?" And the doctor said, "But Mrs. Jones, all of life is a sacrament." And Jones never forgot that. And that is the meaning of the Anathemata. Everything has ultimate significance. And that significance is represented in the Eucharist, which for Jones is the central act of Western culture. His poetry comes from a rich literary culture. And it's so rich because he never went to school. In other words, he didn't imbibe the conventions of academic training which tell you when to stop. He just kept reading, and in his work, he alludes richly, more richly than probably any other writer other than Joyce. At the end of his life, a friend of his came to him, visit him one day, and said, "Of course, your pictures are more important than the poetry." And he mulled this over for a week, and when he saw his friend again, he said, "You know, that's not true. The poetry is more important than the pictures."